So today's, as you can see, the presentations before were discussing very long stretches of time. Some of the presentations were discussing stretches that could cover hundreds of years. Today's presentation is covering a stretch of time that's few months. It's actually mostly during the year of 1948, plus or minus some months before and after. So the inflicting point of that entire problem in Palestine was the 1948, the Nakba. And the main reason that until now, the archives of the Israeli government have a top secret coverage for all kinds of archives related to Nakba. They want to cover the sheer extent of atrocities that they have inflicted upon all the Palestinian civilians who lived in that land, and the hundreds of thousands who have been forced to leave, and the thousands who lost their lives, and a country that have been literally stolen from its own people. So the Nakba is the peak of all what have been the preparation that have been happening before. So if you remember from the last presentation, there was the Balfour Declaration in 1917, and then followed by the British control, the British mandate of the land of Palestine after they took over it from the Ottoman Empire, and then the floodgates that have been opened for Jewish, what they call Aliyah, which is immigration of Jews to come and settle in the Holy Land. All of that was preparation for that moment. And there was a big group of paramilitary group for the Jews called Haganah, another one called Erwin. All of these are paramilitary groups that became the Israeli Defense Forces later on. Those have been the main tool that have been used by the Israeli people to force an expulsion and an exodus for the Palestinians. So the very important point that I need to focus on in Nakba is a question: why it's important to know about it, and what is the narrative that Palestinians have versus the narrative the Israelis publish. So it's remembered on May 15, but actually this is just a day for remembrance, but it's stretched over many months. The reason that it's remembered on that day because the day before it is the day when Israel declared its independence from the British mandate and the establishment of the Israelis. That was May 14. So May 15 is the first day of Nakba, or the day that Nakba is remembered. So what is Nakba? Nakba means the catastrophe. It's the huge loss of state property, lives, and land and homes that affected nearly 800,000 Palestinians. And the Nakba is the turning point that made the conflict transfer from being an internal conflict to a regional conflict. Because part of the events of the Nakba is that the Arab forces started to have some intervention that, as we're going to see, was intervention led by most of the Arab countries around Palestine at that time were ruled by the British, were still under the British control. You can see that the Arab 1948 war, the Arab-Israeli war, was under a huge influence from the British to make it a failure from even before it started. So let's go to the questions that we have. So why it's important to care about this? So the Nakba is the turning point, and we need to care about it because we need to care about Palestine, and we need to care about Palestine because Palestine is a holy land in Islam, and it hosts one of the holiest sites in Islam, the third most holy site in Islam, which is Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa. That's why we need to care about it. Imagine if someone took Mecca from us. Imagine if someone took Medina from us. Taking Al-Quds from us is the same, exactly the same as taking Mecca and Medina from us. So that's why we need to care. The other question here is, was it a voluntary flight or a forced expulsion? These are the two narratives. If you're going to remember one thing from my presentation today, please remember that part. The Israeli narrative focus on the fact, on what they claim as the fact that Nakba was a voluntary flight, that people fled their homes by their choice, that no one forced them to leave. They left, and when they left, it became a land without owners, and now the Israelis took over that land because now the status of the land changed from being owned by people to being a land that's owned by no one after people voluntarily left. That's the narrative that the Israeli always publish and always publicize, which is a wrong narrative. What happened was a forced expulsion, was an ethnic cleansing by all means, by all measures. And that's the Palestinian narrative, which is the true narrative that have been proved true, even by the Israeli neutral historians. Witness that, and there's actually a group of Israeli historians, they call them the new historians, who started to dig in what was available from the Israeli archives, and they were able to show very clearly the Israeli forced that expulsion of people, that exodus of people out from the land of Palestine. So this is a very important question. Was it a voluntary flight or a forced expulsion? It was a forced expulsion. It was an ethnic cleansing. All right, so let's see some facts. These facts help us to understand why this was an ethnic cleansing, why that was a forced expulsion. All started by the partition. In 1947, by the end of 1947, actually in November 1947, the British, when they found that things are getting out of their control, they started to hand over the entire problem of Palestine to the United Nations. And the United Nations ended up by issuing the partition mandate, which actually gave nearly half of the land to the Jews and half of the land to the Palestinians. So the land that's darker in color was given to the Palestinians, which is mainly the West Bank. As you can see, Gaza at that time was as big as as you can see here, including part of Negev. And the most important part is here. This part was given to the Palestinians in that partition. But the Palestinians at that time considered that to be an unfair partition because the Jews at that time in the Palestinian mandate were about 6% of the population. So the UN handed 6% of the population half the land and handed for 94% of the population the other half of the land. And they decided that Jerusalem would stay as a neutral international. So that partition was considered illegal and unfair from the Arab and the Palestinian standpoint, was the trigger that triggered everything after. So what happened? There was reported 70 massacres. The most famous of them is the massacre of Deir Yassin. 70 massacres where 15,000 Palestinians at least have lost their lives and much more have been injured. A lot of them have been severely injured. So that's what was the Haganah paramilitary Israelis doing. They were entering the villages and pushing the people, forcing the people out. And whoever don't get out, they kill them on the spot. Women, kids, look at that. 500 villages have been depopulated. The biggest of them was the city of Haifa. That's a huge city. The city of Haifa was all the Arabs and Muslims in it were pushed out from it in one night. 800,000 Palestinians lost their home within a matter of few months, mostly within the 2 months of the peak of the Exodus, which happened during that time. So now after we have seen these facts, let's look at the war crimes that happened during that time. I want us, all of us, to understand that label. What happened was a war crime. Massacring civilians, that's a war crime by definition. The psychological warfare during that time, the Israelis had their military vans go through the villages with loudspeakers, spreading threats and chaos all around the villages. You have to leave, otherwise we're going to kill you. People are coming here tonight to kill everyone. You have to leave today. Stuff like that. That's psychological warfare. And even more than that, they started targeting and assassinating the leaders of the Palestinians. Palestinians at that time, they are awa'il. They are like big families. So they started to target the heads of the influential heads of some families. Biological warfare, that's something that's not very well known, by the way. They started to pollute the water resources for the villages. They started to go around the villages and pour typhoid, which is a fatal pathogen, into the water sources and the wells. They were trying to spread chaos. They were trying to spread disease. They were trying to spread fear. That's acts of terror by definition. And even after people left, they started to do mass looting of the property. They started to enter houses and loot all what they can find. And towards the end, I'm going to share with you a quote that's very impactful about the extent of looting that happened at that time. And by the way, that didn't stop at that time. They looted the houses in Gaza a few months ago. When the people in northern Gaza were left, the Israeli forces that entered started to loot the houses in northern Gaza. And this have been documented. And the Israeli forces, the Israeli army, actually published that they're going to do an internal investigation in that. Looting property, that's another war crime. They started to do an erasure. They started to erase history of the places that they took over. They started to populate the villages with Jewish people, and the villages that they could not repopulate, they started to farm big trees in them so that they can look like woods and no one can see that these actually, there were people living here before. They started to change the name of the villages and the streets and everything from the Arabic names to Hebrew names. They started to systematically deny all of that. Like they did it and then they legalized it, its impact, and now they are denying that it happened in the way that they did it. As I mentioned to you, there is a group of Israeli historians, they call themselves the new historians. They started to document all of that. And because they are doing that, they are being targeted by the Israeli government. A lot of them are actually history professors in the universities, and they have been targeted by the Israeli government, and they have been banned from attending their universities or seeing their students because of that. One of the biggest war crimes that happened is the statelessness and denationalization of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians. A lot of Palestinians lost their state and lost their nationality. No one now will accept their IDs, their passports, because they are now belonging to a state that does not exist. So hundreds of thousands of people lost their citizenship and lost their nationality. That's another war crime. Now that we understood that that was a forced expulsion, ethnic cleansing, war crime, that was not a voluntary flight. Now let's go and understand another very important thing. What was the turning point? The turning point that started all of that was UN partition. That decision that split Palestine between the Jews and the Arabs gave the Jews 50%, although that they were only 6% of the population, and gave the Arabs 50%, although that they were 94% of the population. That UN partition is described by Arab historians as following: the one who does not own promised the land to the one who does not deserve. The one who does not own gave the land to the one who does not deserve. That's basically what happened. And because of that partition, a lot of dissent and hate started to happen between the people who lived together in Palestine, the Jews, the Muslims, and even the Christians. By the way, Christian Palestinians have suffered the same like Muslims. And because all of that started to happen, the British started started to realize that they have created a big mess. So they started to try to regain order. And in order to do that, they started to force Jews to stop what they're doing. So the Jews started to attack the British forces. They bombed the British forces. They attacked the British camps. So the British decided to retreat and leave Palestine. So that was the end of the British mandate, which happened a few months after the UN partition. And once they left, Israel declared independence. That was on May 14th of 1948. And Nakba started on the next. So the turning points is the UN partition that happened in November 1947, followed by the British mandate and followed by the Israeli independence. All right, so now we are talking about a lot of history. Let's understand something about the timeline. What happened? So it never started in 1947. It started much more before that. Actually, in February 1945, they have the Israeli Haganah, which was the biggest group of paramilitaries that used to do a lot of terrorizing acts that not only inflicted the Palestinian Muslims, but also the Palestinian Christians and even the British troops. They had a plan to suppress Palestinian Arab resistance. So they started to assassinate the leaders. They started to do a forced takeover and a forced expansion of land and territory. And then during the time between May 1947 and December 1947, they started to implement more plans. One of them is the Plan B and the Plan C. Plan Jamel, very famous Plan Jamel, is a plan that they used to attack civilians and public property and spread fear and chaos. Deir Yassin massacre was done under the umbrella of that Plan Jamel. And they started to attack even the British interests in the land until the British left. And then when all of that was culminating, the UN partition happened in November 1947. The UN approved the partition plan. And then a few months later, the forced expulsion started to happen. And the city of Caesarea, south of Haifa, was the first city that was affected by that huge exodus of Palestinians because the Haganah forces started to attack the civilians and kill people and loot houses. So the people started to run for their lives. And that started in February 1948. It started to get bigger and bigger in magnitude. By March 1948, the Haganah started to implement what's called Plan Dalet or Plan D, where they started to seize as much territory as possible. Remember when I told you that half of the land in the partition by the UN was given to the Jews and half of the land was given to the Palestinians? That half that was given to the Palestinians, 60% of it was lost by the Haganah attacks to the Jews. So now even the half was given to the Arabs, most of it was lost because of that Plan D, the significant territory expansion that they started to do by force, killing people, forcing people out, and controlling land by force. During the time between by May 1948, the Arab countries around Palestine started to realize that we have to intervene. But remember, all the Arab countries around Palestine at that time were under colonial influence. So Egypt was still under the British control. Jordan was still under the British control. Syria and Lebanon were still under the French control. I'll tell you one fact about the Israeli-Arab War of 1948. One fact, and you can imagine everything after that. The leader of the Jordanian army in this war was a British officer. His name was John Glubb. Imagine a British officer is the leader of the Arab army. Of course, you can imagine what happened. The UN, following all of that mess, by March 1949, the Arab forces were not achieving any kind of good achievements, and they ended up by being defeated because their leaders and their logistics were run by the colonial powers that really wanted for Israel to start. It was all planned. The UN resolution 194, very famous resolution, was passed in December 1948 during the war, trying to push on Israel to let the refugees, the exodus, the 800,000 Palestinians that left, to allow them to come back. But of course, that never happened. And it will never be allowed by the Israeli state. The results of the Arab-Israeli War of 1948 was devastating. Loss of 60% of the land partitioned to the Arab. And they call it, Israelis call this war the War of Independence. So now they took the land. That was an illegal action. Now they want to legalize it, to make it formal, because it's all about legalities at this point. They want to paint that ugly picture with some good paint so that they can sell it to the world. They want to sell to the world that now they are a state so that the world can start to give them recognition. That's a very important thing. When someone steals, they always want to be recognized as not the one who steals. So they started to legalize it through the Lausanne Conference in 1949, which failed to give the Arabs any kind of rights, and through denying the UN resolution 194. And then Israel was accepted in the UN as a state at that year. That's very sad that the UN that claimed that it's standing for the rights of people, now it's giving those thieves who stole the land all the rights to become states, which is a hypocrisy. But unfortunately, the UN Palestine at that time, and unfortunately even until now, was controlled by Western powers that see the Arabs and the Muslims as second-degree citizens of this universe. So now Israel is selling itself to the outer world and trying to gain recognition and legalize its presence in the outer world. But what about inside Israel? They started to issue a group of laws to legalize the process of stealing land. So they issued some laws like the absentees property laws, prevention of infiltration law to prevent people from coming back to their property, land acquisition law to legalize the acquisition of all land, land ordinance law to allow the acquisition of public property. And then after they legalize it, the UN now wanted to look nice after it allowed all those bad things to happen. So they started the UNRWA, the United Nations establishment, through a resolution of 302 in 1949. The UNRWA is the entity under the umbrella of the United Nations that takes care of all the Palestinian refugees, building camps for them, providing them with education, food, supplies, logistics, that kind of stuff. So they caused the problem, and now they want to look nice. So they created that entity to make themselves look nice. And now they are defunding it. The US, the UK, Canada, and Australia, all of them a few months ago declared that they are going to stop funding the UNRWA. So even that small act that they did trying to cover the crimes that they did to the Palestinians, now they are not allowing it to. Even that small thing, now they are not allowing it to. All right, so what's the impact? What happened after all of that? I'll share with you a quote from an Israeli historian just to understand the impact of it. David Ben-Gurion, the first president of the Israeli state. He said on the 24th of July 1948, it turns out that most of the Jews are thieves. Of course, he's not talking about all the Jews in the world. He's talking about the Israeli people who lived in Palestine at that time, who started to steal property and loot property that doesn't belong to them. Netiva Ben Yehuda, which is an Israeli scholar, he said that he felt so bad because what he had seen, the looting that happened for the Palestinian property, reminded him of the looting that happened to the Jewish property in the 1800s and the 1700s when the Jews used to live in concentration areas. And every now and then, those areas are exposed to calamities by people who don't like them. So the anti-Semitism that they suffered from, now they are inflicting it on others. That's sad. Look at what he said. Such pictures were known to us. It was the way things had always been done to us in the Holocaust and throughout the World War and all the pogroms. How well we know those pictures. And here, we were doing these awful things to others. We loaded everything onto the van with a terrible trembling of the hands, and that wasn't because of the weight. Even now, my hands are shaking just from writing them. So at those words for that Israeli historian, I would like to pay the tribute to all the brothers and sisters who lost their lives in the Nakba, and pay tribute to all the brothers and sisters who witnessed the Nakba and still living among us. By the way, there's a lot of them who have been children at that time and now they are elders. The Nakba wasn't that far away. Maybe one of your grandparents have witnessed the Nakba. It wasn't that far along. May Allah make all of us among the people who make that correct back again to the Palestinian people, and may Allah make us among those who get the Masjid al-Aqsa back to the Muslims, inshallah. Jazakumullah khairan for listening, and I hope that was helpful for everyone. Please let me know if you have any questions, thoughts, or ideas.